what is your key highlights? If you had a 2 minute highlight of the top things that you found in the report, where would you go?
Yeah. So, okay, there's lots of exciting stuff. And I suppose the most interesting thing for me was that we did a really deep dive into specific practices and how each individual one has a relationship to the outcome. So, like a lot of reports might say something like, if you do this set of practices, it's going to give you some outcomes. But we wanted to kind of really get under the skin and look at what does this practice mean? Which one's got the biggest effect on these different outcomes? And I suppose I'm a little bit too proud of that part of it because it's really in depth. And we found a lot of people are doing GitOps, but they're not um, leaning into the reconciliation loop. And this shows us that if you don't lean into that reconciliation loop, you don't get the benefits. So, like, we actually have like all of the paperwork stamped saying, yes, we should be continuously reconciling for it to be proper GitOps, right? It's not just opinions, it's pretty strong data. So
Now,
yeah, that's exciting for me.
now in the research that you show that you did, they're not doing the reconciliation like you said. What about surfacing when drift occurs? Like, are they still are people still surfacing that, but are they just not taking actions on it, or what are you seeing in that sense?
So there's a mix. I'm going to look at the graph whilst I talk about this.
Okay.
So there's like a proportion of people doing automatic reconciliation. Gold stars, well done. Then there's probably like I'm not totally against this. I think this is an okay way of doing things. They get notified when there's a problem. So instead of just nuking it and making it back to how it should be, which is what you're doing in the automatic one, you flag it and you go like, "Hey Bob, someone's changed the number of replicas on this cluster. Um, is that okay, or do you want to change it back?" So a human can
Mm.
then make a decision. But then there's a whole bunch of people who are also just manually doing it, right? So I presume there's a whole mixture of ways of doing this manually. I don't think they're making the change in the config in Git and then manually making the change to the running infrastructure. But I think what they're doing is they are choosing to run a reconciliation at a specific time, a little bit like how you might think of when we used to deploy once a month, we would
Hmm.
choose which day it was going to be, and then we'd go in and we'd do the deployment. I think there's a people doing that where they go and they run a command to do the reconciliation, or they push a button to do the reconciliation, so that they can watch it because they don't trust the process. Um,
It is that because I get so I'm going to go back to my database deployment days, and automating database deployments. And one of the things that came up quite frequently from the DBAs when we were doing this was how do you reconcile drift? So we have the desired state of what we want the database to look like, or the migration scripts to get us to the point where we can see how the database looks, and then how the database actually is. And so then we apply the migration scripts, happy days, kind of exact same way we were seeing with GitOps. I have a desired state, I apply it. But then they say, well, what happens if something changes in the database before you apply the migration script? So I tested on dev, I tested on test, I tested on staging, and I had a certain state of the database that I was going against. But then when I get to production, it blows up because there's a state that I wasn't expecting. There's a column that was there that I wasn't expecting. There's a table that was there. There's some sort of change that was there that I wasn't expecting. And so, like, how do you account for that drift and how do you reconcile it? And so my first question to the DBAs was, why on earth is production not matching all of the other environments when it comes to this type of drift? Like, why is that drift happening in the first place? Is it a manual thing of production is down and we gotta, or we're seeing big, no, not necessarily production is down, but we're seeing big performance problems. So we got to throw an index on there. I wonder if the same thing is happening with, with GitOps. So I assume most of the research that you did was Kubernetes based, and they so you're talking about number of nodes, number of replicas, everything along those lines. And so it's like, oh my gosh, we're seeing some performance hits or whatever the case may be. Okay, well, let's just scale horizontally. Let's add more replicas or any number of those different types of things. So is it a case of they had a production issue? Is it happening typically in production? They had a production issue and they're trying to get back up and running, or is it a case of it's in a lower environment and they just have poor control over people just changing state willy-nilly?
So I think there's going to be a mixture of these reasons. I think when you're doing the kind of either the one where you get notified that there's been drift and
Mm-hmm.
you kind of hold on to it and review it. I think when you're using that mechanism, it makes it more likely that you will, um, for an emergency, you'll make a change to production and let the drift detection highlight it, and use that as the mechanism to undo it when the emergency is over.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost kind of like that's a very natural workflow if you're being notified of drift. And I think if you're using tools that aren't supporting that full GitOps journey, because there's a whole bunch of tools where by default they work in a way that means the reconciliation is going to happen. But there's also tools out there that work differently.
Yeah.
They store some information and you generate a script and then you review it. And there's all kinds of flavors of tools out there. And there was a good portion of people that weren't using Kubernetes as well.
Mm.
So they're trying to apply some of the GitOps principles to other kinds of infrastructure, maybe using, Bicep or Terraform and other
Yeah.
tools rather than things like Argo. So yeah, I think the tools can make a big difference to this, and then the way you use them, because with the databases, if your database project deploys very easily and you need to add an index, actually the easy way of doing it is to do it in the project and then
Yeah.
you roll it through your environments to make sure that it doesn't explode when you do it. So you're not just making that live change, it doesn't have to take too much extra time and it just makes it kind of safer. You can be less stressed when you're pressing the buttons.
That's
So yeah.
that's the question I always come back to. So, you say that drift occurs and they haven't had a good reconciliation process. My first question naturally is going to be, why is drift occurring and why is it happening to such a state that you have a process to try to either manually reconcile it or, alert it or anything like that? And so who's going in and changing, basically who's going in and changing the desired, what you're deploying to, or the application host, or whatever the case may be, that allows that to occur. Why do they have the permissions? What are they going to do like that? How do you what quality control do you have in place? What auditing do you have in place? Anything along those lines to kind of prevent someone from going rogue. Back to your point of my first question is also, why aren't I want to make a change to the number of replicas. Use Kubernetes. That's the easiest one. I want to change the number of replicas. Why aren't you just making the change using the normal workflow and having it promote through appropriately and go through all of the auditing that you already have built up and you can prove out and you can report on and everything like that? So then you don't have this type of situation where production doesn't match your desired state because some reason.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I think it might be a little bit of habit, because if you are dealing with if you're dealing with an incident, and so you kind of get used to making a couple of changes, making sure everything
Hmm.
works okay, and your process around that is that you log what you're doing as part of the incident, right? You have some kind of template, and you're putting on all the steps as you go through fixing stuff. Um, but if you're using GitOps, you don't need to do that because that's all baked in.
Yeah.
So in a way, you would be saving yourself a lot of manual administration to do it properly as a change in Git. That's got your audit trail, it's got your review, it's got a good way of promoting it. It's like the safe way of doing it. It can be safe and quick. So I think that's surprising that people wouldn't do it. But equally, most people don't have 100% of adoption with GitOps yet. It's being used for a percentage of their production systems.
Mm.
And when you've got access to the whatever you're using, right, the command line or the the cloud management portal. When you've got access to that, it's kind of tempting to fix everything the same way. So all of your non-GitOps applications, you would go and manually change them. So when something goes wrong with one that is using GitOps, you've already got the portal open maybe, or you're just in the habit of opening it. So it's hard to break that habit when you don't have everything running in that way. So yeah, I would do it. The way I've done it with databases in the past is once you have the project up and running, you kind of like start taking away the keys to the castle and
Yeah.
getting people to use the database project as the way of doing those operations. Because that's the reminder for yourself.
And I'm sure I don't know if you ever worked at companies where you hear about stories about back in the day. Back in the day, we used to be able to do all this crazy stuff. So back in the day at Octopus Deploy, when I first joined, because myself and Ryan Russo, we are the first US-based employees. In fact, our very first day, I always tell the story, our very first day, we boarded a plane to Australia because there's literally no one here to onboard us. We had to go down to Australia for 2 weeks. And as a result of that, we were such a small company at the time that everyone had keys to the kingdom. Like I was given access to our production Azure account. And every once in a while, giving a really good example, our octopus.com website, it would run out of memory or hit some sort of block. And the best way to just solve the problem, get us back up and running, just go in and reset the app, Azure web app, and it would, or recycle it and it would just work again. Happy days. And so like you just kind of get used to like, hey, this is how we're going to solve that. Now, naturally, as we've grown as a company, like this is 2018, I'm telling you this is what we're doing. Now, naturally, as we grow as a company, we add security people, we add all of these other people. We want to be SOC 2 compliant, ISO 27001 compliant, everything like that. All of that access immediately was revoked. I mean, I can't do any of that stuff anymore. So I was like, again, back in the day, I used to be able to do that. I used to be able to log in production and change whatever I wanted. But obviously now I can't do that for obvious reasons because you don't want someone in revenue being able to do that. But yeah, it's just the nature of I think the beast as well. Like kind of back to your point where people, when you have those keys to the kingdom, you follow the path of least resistance to reconcile the process or resolve the issue that's happening, and then you kind of do it and ask for permission later, versus or ask for forgiveness later versus I need to get permission, I need to do this type of thing, I need to follow the workflow, anything like that. But ultimately, why you want to follow the workflow, why you want to follow that process is you have all of the guardrails in place, ideally to prevent any sort of problems. The worst thing in the world that you could do is if there's a fire going on, is run up to it and pour a bunch of gasoline on it. And every time you just make a change in production without following the appropriate protocols and process, you don't know if you're going to be pouring gasoline on the fire or if you're pouring water on the fire. You hope you're pouring water on the fire, but you're never 100% sure.
Everyone's done that emergency
Oh, yeah.
fix for
Yes.
something that wasn't actually that big a deal, but then the fix makes it into a really big deal.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I recycled the app pool. Now we have a bigger memory leak. Now we crashed all the other apps. Uh-oh. You know.
Well,
Yeah.
you've inspired me over the last couple of weeks by talking about the Phoenix project. I started to listen through it again, and I've got to the point where I can't remember the big incident, but it's like we want. I think it's when Bill has maybe just resigned, and it's because we
Yeah,
want
you you
all
finally
the
like
hands on the
lost his mind.
keyboards.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's like everyone in, and it's like everything's gone. It's all
Yeah.
crash.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you made it like you made a bad situation worse by just like
yeah,
I just need to have, boots on the ground to solve this particular problem. Yeah, I
yes,
remember that. I remember that. I finished
yeah,
reading it, listening to it about a month or so ago. So yes, I remember that
yeah,
exact point because that was kind of like
yes,
the big, I would say, I mean, it follows a traditional three-act structure. So that's kind of like the big, thing that happens in the second act, that kind of like big climax that occurs.
yes, for
So.
sure. James, you're very welcome. How's it going?
Great. How are you
Yeah,
all?
we have a guest today.
Good.
We have
Yeah,
James has joined us.
Well,
yeah.
I had a question for Bob and I saw this on your calendar and I was like, oh, I didn't even know if this was a thing. So I figured it said office hours. I figured I'd pop in and see what was going on. And yeah, what a crew.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
By all
we
means.
just record what we're saying and put it up there on the interwebs, where we
Do
trash
people
talk something.
do? Oh, is this does this go on like the YouTube channel or?
I can edit it out, but by all means, ask your question. This is pretty
Yeah,
much what we do.
if you got
We
interesting
we
questions,
Oh,
yeah.
apologies. I thought
That
this
could
was
take
like
us on an
an
interesting
office
thread.
Yeah.
This is better.
Yeah, it's like
what we
it's like
want.
a random guest that just joined us.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I like
No, don't be sorry.
I had no idea. I
Good.
and I have a call in 10 minutes, so this is for that. But I wanted to kind of hear about the Terraform provider now that it is out in V1. What does that mean for like our customers and for us?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for up until V1, it was really kind of hard to say, yes, we have near total coverage of the APIs. Whatever you can do using the API scripts, you can do within Terraform. We didn't have support for things such as step templates inside of the Terraform provider. Now we have the support for those step templates. Like we solved some issues around managing our deployment process, made it a better approach overall as opposed to how we had it in the past. So we solved a number of massive challenges that were occurring that our customers were bumping into every time they had trying to use the Terraform provider, and made it truly a world-class experience. And it's gotten to that point where like, yes, now we feel confident about promoting it, and we know that it's going to have these coverage, and we know we've smoothed over a lot of those sharp edges that people were running into. So that's when we say it's V1, that's kind of what we mean. Is like, yes, we have that kind of that feature parity. I guess feature parity is not really the right term, but coverage, appropriate coverage with whatever you can do with the API. Ideally, you can do with the Terraform provider, but it might just be a slightly different way of doing it.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I kind of how I understood it too. So is it fair to say with V1, is that a first class recommendation for, hey, you want to, scale out your Octopus instance, like this is what you should be using?
If that's one of the approaches you want to take, because I think one of the challenges with once you go with a Terraform approach is you're managing state. It's where you manage the state. So now before, if you weren't using the Octopus Terraform provider, you could do everything inside of the Octopus UI. You make any sort of changes or anything like that. It's funny, we were just talking about reconciling state with the State of GitOps report. If I'm using the Terraform provider to manage Octopus deploy, what that means is that if I go in and I make a change inside the Octopus deploy user interface, the next time I apply the Terraform files to my Octopus instance, likely it's going to overwrite it because drift has been detected and it has occurred. So you're changing the interface in which people are going to be managing their Octopus instance if you go that route. So it's something that people should be aware. So if this is something that they want to do, if they're comfortable with using the Terraform provider, and they're comfortable, not just Terraform provider, but just Terraform in general, if that's something that you want to do as a user, absolutely, that could be very beneficial. And we also have that tool Octoterra that can definitely help you out with converting a project to Terraform. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing type of thing. It could be, I want to manage these certain key resources. So for example, in our samples instance, we're managing like certain variable sets, certain feeds. We make sure that, hey, everyone has those things. We want to make sure there's no drift that occurs in those. But everything else, people kind of have free reign over doing, like managing projects or whatever. So it's really up to what the people want to manage. Why I'm excited step templates were included specifically for custom step templates is that's always been one of the biggest bears with Octopus is how do I manage custom step templates with the Octopus deploy UI? I can't really save that inside of version control, versioning, rollbacks, all that other stuff is not really as world class. But with the Terraform provider, now all of that's stored inside of Git, and so now you have the kind of that workflow that happens.
Right. So and since it's not all or nothing, if I'm a large enterprise, I want to scale out my instance, maybe use Terraform for setting up the scaffolding around spaces, and then the individual projects and project groups, and those are on a like team by team basis in the UI.
Yeah, absolutely. And once we release because we're adding in process templates and project templates and policies and everything like that, I think they could be a nice complement with one another. So like back to your point, I want to have something that will set up scaffolding. And so the Terraform provider could be absolutely perfect for that. But then I have these project templates and they have process templates. And then that allows me to add the projects. And now I have a nice workflow built into Octopus to manage all of that. So it's a kind of, think of it like peanut butter and jelly or Reese's peanut butter cup. It's a great chocolate to the peanut butter.
Amazing.
Nice.
Great.
Yeah.
That answers that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Good.
Well, I'm gonna hop off. Tony, do some editing around that. Sorry to interrupt, but it sounds like it will be beneficial at the end. So
Yeah.
Yeah. All good.
Perfect. Yeah.
good
Thanks,
stuff.
James.
See you all. Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
See you in a bit.
Bye.
Bye.
It just reminded
Uh,
me, Bob, of Tony and I had this really weird thing in GitHub where on one of our websites that we have in there, we were just going and changing one of the settings.
Mm.
And Tony kept on saying, "Did you change this setting? Because it's still not working." And I'd go back and I'd be like, "Oh, no, I haven't. I thought I'd done that." And so I'd change it again. I'd update Tony, "You can do it now." And he'd come back again and go, "No, it still doesn't work." And it's because we use Terraform on our GitHub repositories to enforce a whole bunch of settings.
Yeah.
And of course, I'd completely forgotten that Terraform's running there in the background. And every time I hit this box and hit save, and then confirmed it with my authenticator app, like to say that I wanted to change, every time I did that, like literally a minute later, it was gone.
Yeah. I think that's maybe that's one of the reasons with the when people say they don't have the automatic reconciliation is that you could destroy something you meant to do,
Hmm.
but you're doing it outside the workflow that you should be doing it. But yes, and then you end up with confusing yourself. It just reminded me of, did you ever use Oracle databases or work with Oracle databases? Okay, so one of the most interesting quirks with Oracle, at least at the time I was using it over 12 years ago, is if you made any sort of change, insert, delete, update, you had to commit. And if you ever used one of the Oracle user interfaces, you would make a change to the database. And there was another button that did a commit. So run it, see it, commit it. You always had to remember hit commit. And so much so that if I started a new session, I might not see the changes unless I hit the commit. So I'd be selecting and I'd be like, why am I not seeing this data? Why am I not seeing this data? Why am I not seeing this data? I'm like, then I hit the commit button and everything would work. Yeah,
So it's like an automatic transaction for those.
yeah, it
types of
automatically
queries.
it put it into kind of like this temporary memory. I'm not quite sure, like a temporary memory table or something like that. And yeah, and so you could actually overflow that temporary information. And so if you would have to commit after like say 1,000 commits, depending on the size of the table, 1,000 rows, depending on the size of the table or everything like that. I just remember that constantly. And I actually wrote a very low level. We called it. It was a wrapper. I called it the Oracle. It's basically the Oracle data wrapper. It was a very low level library that I wrote that automatically did all that for you. So you do an insert in using C#, it automatically commit it for you. Because of these types of things, because you're just slowly losing your head. So this concept of, I guess the lesson I'm taking away from this is the concept of state reconciliation and automatic reconciliation and not knowing about these kind of like almost automatic triggers that occur. It's tripped up people, not just recently with GitOps, it's tripped up people for decades. Depends on the technology you're using.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the challenge is partially one of information flow.
Mm-hmm.
So if you aren't aware that GitOps is being used in a particular area, maybe you're not, the cloud infrastructure engineers do all of the GitOps, but you've been drafted in to help on something. Maybe you don't know that the reconciliation loop exists, which makes it likely that you'll just go and use a portal somewhere. So yeah, I think there's definitely a piece there about I think you should be aiming for at the very least automatic detection of drift.
Yes.
And ideally automatic correction of it, because that's what will drive the habit of always making every change through Git. Otherwise, your audit trail is like a 90% audit trail, you know, rather than a 100% audit trail, which is really what you need.
So would you, I guess, would you make the argument that if you wanted to do automatic reconciliation, you would have to take away the keys to the kingdom for most people? Because you would have
Uh,
to, because that forces you to basically, in order to do automatic reconciliation, the first step almost is you have to take away those keys to the kingdom, except for the select few individuals who would remain, because obviously you need to have somebody there, because that would force everyone to follow the process.
yeah, and I think it's like it's painful for a week,
Yeah.
until you just get used to doing it the correct way. So that's how I've done it. Like the number of teams I've joined where everyone has access to everything, and you go through that process of saying, look, we really, as developers, we don't need to just be logging on to production every 5 minutes. Like, oh, someone wanted to know about this data, so I just logged onto the production SQL server and ran a little query to find out. And it's like, we don't need to be doing that. There's better ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, just cutting that off and getting rid of it. You still have a break glass account if you need it, if something goes wrong. But yeah, just it helps to build the habit. I think as long as you've got access to the portal, the virtual machine, the kubectl command, all of those things, it just is easy to forget that you're supposed to make the change in Git.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's not to stop people accessing stuff because they still can access it, right? They still have control to go and change the number of replicas. You're not taking anything away from them. You're just rerouting all of that activity through the thing that's going to secure it and audit it and make it happen.
But the only thing I would counter with that is you'd also need to make sure you have the appropriate information being surfaced outside of those tools. So if you always use, I come from a VM world. I used to deploy to Windows, so that's the world I know about. Um, I was used to logging into Windows and looking at the perfmon, and looking at the event manager and looking at these different types of things to see what kinds of problems there are. But once New Relic came about, my desire to log in to remote into these virtual machines was virtually eliminated because I got the same information. In fact, I got it even better because I got historical information, which was fantastic. And I got it in a much better interface dedicated to solving that. I could see across multiple different application hosts, which was fantastic. So you also need to, and not just take away the rights, but you also need to have a mechanism to surface that information that people were previously trying to acquire. Uh, One of the more interesting things that we saw with Octopus was the Kubernetes live object status. Uh, that surfaced a whole bunch of information that previously I had written runbooks for. And so once I saw the Kubernetes live object status come about, I was like, oh, I don't need that runbook. I don't need that runbook. I don't need that runbook because I had all that information. Because previously, what the runbook was doing, it was using kubectl to pull that information and then just present it in the log. And I'm like, okay, it worked. It was okay. It wasn't that great. But with Kubernetes Live Object Status, we moved that exact same information, but we made it in a much easier to consume format than just a raw log being dumped out of kubectl. So I think that's probably another huge part of it is you have to surface that information. Otherwise, people are just going to endlessly complain because now it's like, well, now we can't do our job. Now we don't have that information. Now, only the blessed can view it.
The funny thing about that is you get a double win
Yeah.
because um, the information is often useful to people who you would never have given access to in the first place.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think the live object status is a good example because the Octopus UI, the whole idea behind this is that it goes beyond developers. In my previous role, the product owner was in there, the testers were in there because they could all do things in Octopus that they wouldn't have been allowed to do manually, like deploy to test, like by copying the application or get hold of log files or whatever it is you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you can funnel it all into that UI, you actually make it available to a whole bunch of other people. And that's kind of cool because otherwise they wouldn't have that information at all. So it's like the person who needs the information regularly, who was going and getting it with elevated access, they still get it, but then so does everyone else. And I used Datadog.
Yep.
It's quite interesting. We've just literally announced the Datadog Octopus integration.
Yep.
And Datadog was great because we could see everything everywhere. All of, like we were dealing with CPUs and memory and SQL compilations and all kinds of stuff like that, which we used to have to log into like a server to see one set of that information, and then we could see it all on a graph, and we could detect anomalies automatically and get all of this extra benefit from it. But we could also stick it on a big wall board, and then our CTO could see that information as well. And we could show the response times and why they were caused by needing more memory. And it just unlocked a bit of budget for upgrading some of our servers. And like all of this other positive stuff happened because we made the information available in a better way. And yeah, I love this stuff. Kubernetes Live Object Status, seeing your deployment times and your deployment frequency in your monitoring tools. These are all great ways of actually driving improvements in your team. Love it.
It's democratizing your whole software delivery pipeline. That's really the deployment pipeline. And that's really, in my mind, that's also incredibly critical, just back to your point of getting information out to everybody, to QA, so they don't have to bother a developer. Hey, what version's in test? I can go to this tool and I can see it. And that's not exclusively the domain of Octopus. I'm also thinking about Argo, because we've been talking about the state of GitOps. It surfaces a lot of that same information. It surfaces, what has been not necessarily what's been changed, but hey, I'm going to apply these types of changes. I can see the drift. I can see everything else. A lot of this type of information. But I also think about, because we were just recently talking, Tony and I, you just mentioned the Phoenix project. When you hoard information, think back to the character Brent, and he was just being pulled in 55 different directions because he was seen as a subject matter expert, because he probably was the only one who could see all of these different things and kind of understood it. And maybe he could interpret the raw data in such a way in his brain then be able to articulate it to people. But when you have these tools like Datadog or New Relic, or you have these tools like Octopus and Argo and CodeFresh, that information surfaced, but we have UI experts that are taking that information and trying to present it to users in a more consumable way, that you don't have to bother the operations person as to what's going on. And maybe you can also provide mechanisms to reconcile it and self-service it yourself, so you're not relying on these heroics. I'm currently listening to the DevOps Handbook on Audible. That's what I do. I just listen to books when I walk my dog. And the word heroics comes up almost all, like it seems like every other word out of the guy's mouth recently has been heroics. And so you kind of see these types of things. The Phoenix Project, it was Brent performing all of these heroics, and that was just a kind of a personification of what could possibly happen. But really, I kind of think back to, like, yes, we want to make sure that everyone has access to this information because it's critical for people to do their jobs. Maybe it's not everyone's using the exact same information. Maybe they're looking at it a different way, but it's still very critical to doing their jobs. And then also providing the tools to not necessarily give them kubectl access, but provide that kind of limited controlled kubectl access, via, like, say, an Octopus runbook to perform a very specific task. And you don't have to give the keys to the kingdom. You can just say you only can give permission to do that one particular thing, for example.
Yeah, every ticket you can stop from being raised is time saved.
Yeah.
And with the information flow, like Ron Westrom, when he was talking about what is the culture that's required for safety critical industries, and it turns out, in my opinion, that this is the culture that you need everywhere. Information flow is that crucial element. And it's interesting, actually. So I was a director in a previous role, but I couldn't see the balance sheet. I couldn't see how much different customers were worth to help prioritize. I was in charge of deciding what we were going to work on, because I was the director of product and data. But I couldn't tell whether a customer was incredibly valuable or losing us money. That visibility just wasn't there. So I couldn't make good decisions. And so when I joined Octopus, I came in as like a individual contributor, and Octopus share that information with employees every month. It's just there. It's public to us all, so we can see what's going on. And that was just such a surprise to me. And I think it's such a strong signal that if the information is just available, for me now, if I'm looking at organizations, those are the kind of organizations that I want to like participate in. The ones that have
Mm.
got really good information flow. You need to know what's going on to make good decisions.
Yeah, and it's not exclusive. Like I think it's a great point. It's not exclusively IT related information, the performance of a particular application. That's certainly a piece of it, but that's a really good point about the budgeting aspect as well, because it really helps us prioritize. If we see if there's a very particular issue and it risks $5 million in ARR, chances are we're going to prioritize that over an issue that jeopardizes $500 in ARR. You're like, yeah, that's just common sense, and it allows you to reconcile it and do a better job. One of the more interesting things, when you're listening to the DevOps handbook and you listen to Phoenix Project as well as the Unicorn Project, is they talk about the Toyota and the whole concept of the Andon cord. And
Mm.
when they first initially implemented the Andon cord, they set these certain requirements. This is what would cause you to pull the Andon cord. So they would do that, and then they would also have this whole concept of you would have to continuously reconcile and improve. That was a big part of the Toyota process, is you always improve. Why did we pull the Andon cord? How can we prevent this from happening in the future? And so they would make these improvements slowly over time. But then what the managers started noticing is that they started getting fewer and fewer Andon cords, which is a great thing because it shows you that you've improved. So then they turned up what could possibly pull the Andon cord. They changed and they made it much previously weaker signals now became stronger signals. So then now that caused another Andon cord. And so then they improved that. And so they're constantly improving this. But again, you have to surface that information for people to make those improvements and make the appropriate decisions.
Mm.
Yeah, the Andon cord's a really interesting one because um, one way of looking at it is that it is a promise from your leadership that if there is something wrong, they
Yeah.
will reprioritize and come and help you to fix it. I think quite a lot of the time when we bring those things over without bringing that kind of contract with it, it becomes like someone pulls an Andon cord and then they're in trouble
Yeah.
because they've stopped things from moving, which is completely wrong. The whole point is it's you as leaders of this organization, and bearing in mind the cost of stopping a production line in the auto industry is immense, right? It's like the numbers are flying past with every second. So yeah, that commitment of if you think something is wrong, we will all reprioritize and crowd that problem and solve it because we know that fixing it, we truly believe that fixing it now is going to
Mm-hmm.
be cheaper than just letting it slide and trying to do what everyone was doing before the Toyota change, which was we get to the end of the production line and then we try and make things have quality that they didn't have built in. Um, so yeah.
I think one of those, maybe one of the common misconceptions of the Andon cord is that it stops the assembly line immediately. It actually, from what I remember, is that they have a certain period of time to reconcile the problem. And if they can't reconcile the problem within that certain period of time, that's when they do stop the assembly line. Because it might just
Yeah.
be they're missing a part or something's not quite right. And it just takes 30 seconds, a minute, couple minutes, and there's no impact on something like that. So the assembly line can keep on flowing. But with software deployments, internally at Octopus, we have the concept of the Andon cord, and we pull it, and we're given that psychological safety from our leadership. Anyone can pull it. I can go in and I can pull it right now if I want it. Now I'd have some explaining to do if I just did it for demonstration purposes. Um, but if there's a legitimate reason, like I have pulled it in the past because I couldn't run runbooks, as an example. Every time I ran a runbook, I got an error, and that's just because I'm always on a staff instance, so I'm always on the latest bleeding edge of Octopus deploy. And this is a strong signal that this could potentially cause a customer impacting issue. And right now, it's limited to me and maybe 5 or 10 other instances, maybe 20 other instances. It's not the end of the world. But if this gets out to the entire fleet of all of our customer instances, that's a huge problem. So we're given that psychological safety. Yes, go ahead and pull the cord. And that does stop our software delivery process because we work in a very asynchronous world where, uh, you and I, could be it's sometimes it's faster to get a message to Jupiter and back because people are in Australia and are asleep. So that's just something to kind of think about as well. I imagine if we had our R&D staff in the same location as the people who would commonly pull the Andon cord, we might not stop the deployment pipeline right away. We might say, okay, let's triage this issue for, time box it for 10 minutes, and then we make the determination. Okay, this actually, we've made the determination we need to stop it right now.
Yeah, and it's a easier thing to do when stopping a version from going out isn't stopping
Yes.
all work in the business.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's always interesting when we're translating these amazing insights from manufacturing into how that applies to software development. We do need to think about how it translates. I think one of the big things that we realized, and Dave Farley has asserted this quite heavily in his modern software engineering book, is that the part before you commit your code is actually not part of that production line, right? That's all part of the more like the design phase. Whereas a lot of people were trying to treat development and testing as like stages in a production line. It's like, no, the production line happens once you commit, and then you've got your CI process, you've got your CD pipeline, all of those things. That's the factory part of it. Everything before that is design. So understanding where that difference is quite important. Yeah.
I would also make the argument, and I know this is where Dave Farley and I disagree, is that it really triggered the assembly production line is triggered or kicked off when you commit into main, the main branch or anything along those lines. But when you are just committing to, say, short-lived branches, I don't think you should have week-long feature branches. We've talked about this ad nauseum. I think that's a terrible idea. At most, a branch should live maybe at most 2 days, but ideally a couple of hours, to be completely honest. But when you check into those branches, I think you should have kind of almost a subset assembly line where you're just deploying to an ephemeral environment or a dev environment, so you can get feedback. Is this the thing that's I'm actually building? Does it work? And you can bring in, if it's a big enough change, or if it's something that you might want to get some input from other people, other developers on your team, or your business owner, or your product manager, whomever. Then that kind of allows you to get that faster feedback and reconcile that. Now, I know he doesn't disagree with me on that, but it's more along the lines of, I think he disagrees with just the concept of like any sort of like branching. He's a big fan of committing into main and always always committing into main as fast as possible, which I get, like the whole concept of trunk-based development, but I think sometimes you need to have a little bit of wiggle room at times.
Yeah, and the research backs that up, right? We can have up to kind of 3 branches, as long as they're very short-lived, and we get the same benefits that we were getting from trunk-based development, which is directly committing to the main line. So yeah, the research kind of says there is a bit of wiggle room there. I think that's okay. And I would say at that stage, like you're kind of like putting something in a wind tunnel to test it there, right? You still want feedback on it and you want to learn from it. But that's not the production line. That's still part of the design phase. But the commit to main,
I think that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, but you just want to test in a production-like environment. Back to the point of the wind tunnels. It gives you a chance to test in not an exact like environment. I mean, not building the whole plane, but it gives you an idea. Okay, this tweak to this plane will work. It won't cause it to just smash into the ground.
There's a Wright brothers metaphor in there because they were working from some like mathematical tables that were wrong about the design of wings, and they were having a couple of attempts which did result in kind of crashing. And the point was they tried to build things cheaply enough that you could like destroy it and it was fine. But when one of them was in it and it's crashing, they were like, is there a way we can do this without actually risking our lives each time? Because that would be ideal.
I think that's one of the more interesting lessons, like you've said, from manufacturing, or we can also we take a lot of lessons from civil engineering as well. I wouldn't apply that to software development, but one of the key differences is that the risk when it comes to, say, manufacturing, think about like a car, for example, or civil engineering, a bridge, the risk is astronomically higher in terms of human cost because, I mean, you don't want to risk people's lives. So obviously you have a lot more, you have these controls that are in place. And so that's why with software development, where it's a lot more just knowledge-based work, where you're just kind of thinking through things and you're just kind of making things appear out of nowhere, there's like that perception, oh, it's not as risky. But, you know, if you're talking about banks or medical records or any number of those things, that's just as risky. That has a concept on human life. And so that's why I think that sometimes there's this disconnect when you make this, oh, this doesn't apply to us because, it's not as risky. I'm like, well, I worked at a bank and it was providing loans to farmers. And if we messed up, that could mean the farmer doesn't get a loan and he's unable to, he has a delay in feeding, his, his cattle or his sheep or whomever. And that can have a really big impact long term to them and maybe lead them to the point where they end up having to sell the farm or go out of business. I mean, that's a really terrible thing. That's a absolute, terrible possible experience. But you have to think about these types of things. Like, what is the risk when something goes wrong? With Octopus Deploy, okay, a deployment fails. Yeah, that's not good. But what was being deployed, and now we're preventing it from working. That's a big deal because that could be something that's absolutely critical. It could be not just a software that's running on a POS machine that some cashier can't do something. It could be something that's critical, like an MRI machine, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
worked in emergency triage. So we were driving the conversations people had when they dialed emergency services.
Mm.
And we had a pathway that we wanted to try and identify very serious things up front. So that was important. But there was also this crucial problem of making sure that we didn't dispatch an ambulance until we were certain it was needed. Because
Mm.
every ambulance that you send where it's not needed is then not available to someone who really does need it. So it was super interesting how like carefully you had to plan all of that. And we
Yeah.
had so many clinicians that were there to help us understand all these problems. But yeah, that was an example, I suppose, where the software was still life and death. But the software is still very different to engineering because you can change it, right?
Yeah.
So if you're building a hospital and you're halfway through building it and you realize that it's not going to work because the corridors are too narrow and like you won't be able to get beds maneuvering in and out of rooms, right? That's like the actual cost of fixing that is immense. Whereas
Yeah.
usually in software, you can be halfway building something and you find out that it's not going to work. It's actually very easy to then change it to make it so it will work. So those feedback loops that you build in are what makes the end product safe and viable.
I
Yeah.
so I worked with uh, several individuals who worked at a company who provided ankle monitors uh, for criminals, and they not just provided the ankle monitors, but they also wrote the software. And so they're always talking about some ideas that they came up with and some things that weren't. And one of the craziest ideas that was being batted around that never was implemented, that was never really seriously considered beyond the design phase was how could they prevent a criminal from going beyond a geographic boundary or going into a restricted geographic boundary? So, for example, prevent a criminal from going into a school. And so, they were thinking of all kinds of things. Well, could we shock them? I mean, okay, well, how do you handle the battery on something like that? Could we have a little explosive in there? I'm like, well, what if you're wrong? What if there's a bug? That's a pretty significant. Like, you can't unring that bell once you send the shocker, you cause the explosion to go off. That
Once you
round's
blow
already
the leg off.
downrange. You can't bring that back. So
Yeah.
again, yes, you can change it, but it depends on the thing that you're changing.
Yes.
Because the risk of it being wrong is, it can be pretty substantial. So yes, to your point, but I think at the same time, yes, it also context is always key as to what you're working, where does that software running?
Yeah, I
Yes,
think
a
it's
loud
all
audible alarm is
relative.
probably sufficient.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's what they ended up doing. I was like, they're telling me this story, and I'm like, what if you're wrong?
And you have to
That's
think
like,
about
that's what
how
we
it
said
could
too.
be like you have to think about the attack vectors on that.
Yeah.
That if
Oh, yeah.
someone's in your car and they have one of these ankle devices on, you can drive them somewhere where their ankle
Mhm.
thing will give them an electric shock or
Yes.
blow them up. So it
Yeah.
now becomes an attack
They've
vector.
dozed off in the back of the car, and you drive past the limit. They
Yeah.
don't get
Yeah.
to
I
tell
mean,
you.
that was another use case. Like, what happens if that particular thing happens? They didn't mean to. They were in an Uber, and
Yeah,
Uber made the decision to go that way. Um,
yeah.
it's like, whoa, buddy, whoa, no, no.
Not this way. Go the long way.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's always interesting to when you hear those stories about, oh, because the software that I worked on didn't have something like that. It was, you know, that immediate impact, that could potentially cause harm. It was more of the then this, and then this could happen.
yeah. I think it like you called out, it's very contextual until you're in the middle of that scenario in your
Hmm.
place. It might not be life or death, but it feels pretty. Like the one that comes to mind is very recent with Marks and Spencers in the UK, where they've been hacked. So they've locked down. They haven't sold anything online in the last 8 to 10 weeks. They've lost 300
Mm.
million pounds. It's not life or death, but that's pretty sure that'll be top of their agenda for quite a while. Is trying to get that resolved, and I don't think they're any further forward. They're just stuck. So it's um yeah, you're not nobody's going to die over the head of it, but it's a pretty heavy situation to find yourself in.
Yeah.
So,
I think a
yeah,
big hug ops to, I think it was the cooperative who were being hacked, and one of the engineers investigating what was happening realized what was happening and pulled the plug, which takes incredible courage. So
Hmm.
huge hug ops to them. That must have been a very scary moment, and you
yeah,
only know that it was the right thing to do much later. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
it just reminded me of Silicon Valley when Gavin Belson was screaming, "Cut the power to the building," because he downloaded an unauthorized beta onto his personal devices, and the guys found out, and they basically review bombed him. They just caused his computer to crash, and he's like freaked out. It's like, cut power to the building, cut power to the like, yeah. So I imagine it's not nearly the same, but I mean, more of an amusing way to kind of take that. But
yeah.
that's the nth degree of like solution.
Mhm.
But I mean,
Yeah,
if that's the only option, that's the only option. And I mean, you have to make a split second decision. And
yeah,
yeah, it's in that
yeah,
case, yeah, it feels like it would be better to be right. It, it's better to make that mistake than what I imagine it was like the potential consequences was just astronomical. So it's like, all
yeah.
right, this is the best decision at this time. It wasn't, you know, the safest, but it was the best decision possibly.
Yeah.
yeah, I think any engineering leaders out there who are faced with someone who maybe did shut down some service and then it turned out that it wasn't the right answer, I think it's worth thinking about what could have happened.
Yeah.
Go easy on those folks.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, they made the decision with the information that they had at that point in time. It's always easy to in the United States, the phrase that we like to use is armchair quarterback. It's always easy to armchair quarterback something Monday afternoon after the Sunday football games are done. It's always easy to do that, but when you're in the game and you have all the stuff flying around at you, you have all these huge brutes coming at you with full-on pads, 300-pound men.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you made a decision and it made sense at that particular point in time. Turns out it wasn't the right
Yes.
decision, but yeah, you're limited by the context that you have, not
Mm.
could possibly happen.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
not the future context. You don't have the future context. Like, you should know what possibly could happen.
yes. It's a really good analogy. I think any sport you'll hear from the sidelines people shouting, and why didn't you do this? And it's like,
Yeah.
put yourself in the scenario. you didn't see the guy was making the run 40 yards away, or that the person
Yeah.
was running in from behind you. But standing at the side of the pitch, I can see it all. Why didn't he just do
Yeah.
that? It's like,
I don't have eyes in the back of my head.
Yeah.
Can only see something like 140 degrees, that way, if I'm lucky.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.